June 14, 1986, was supposed to be a celebration of everything the small town of Grenville, Pennsylvania, had come to love about its own quiet little world. The town was nestled between long stretches of pine forest and old farmland that turned gold in the summer, a place where time moved slowly and children rode bicycles until the streetlights flickered on. That summer marked the first annual Grenville Summer Music Festival, a modest but hopeful attempt by the local chamber to draw visitors and maybe a little life back into the town. For weeks, the event had been plastered across bulletin boards and grocery store windows. Everyone was buzzing about the arrival of the Arrows, a jazz quartet made up of 4 young musicians who had grown up just a few miles from town. They had moved to Pittsburgh a few years back, but promised they would return home to perform. The Arrows had developed a sound that was smoky and slow-laced with pain and poetry. People said their music felt like something you heard in a dream. The quartet consisted of Alice Munro on vocals and rhythm guitar, Drew Simmons on saxophone, Chris Keller on bass, and Jonah Reed on drums. They had planned to rehearse one last time at the old Miller barn just outside of town before heading to the outdoor stage near the Grenville Fairgrounds. But as the sun began to lower on that warm summer afternoon, no one had seen or heard from the band. The festival started without them. The first few acts played short sets, all waiting for the Arrows to arrive and close the evening with their headlining performance. By 8 p.m., whispers had begun. By 9 p.m., the sheriff was called. By 10, a search party was already combing the back roads leading out to the barn. The Miller barn stood on the edge of a dirt path that twisted through acres of private land. It had once been a working cattle barn, but since the Miller family moved away, it had become a favorite rehearsal spot for local bands. The last confirmed sighting of the group was earlier that day, when a gas station attendant named Kenny Ross swore he saw their green and white van headed toward the barn at around noon. He waved at them. He said they waved back. After that, no one could say for sure what had happened. The sheriff's department found the barn locked. Inside, nothing seemed out of place. The floor was littered with cigarette butts and empty soda bottles. A few amplifier cords were left plugged in, and there were 4 folding chairs circled around a dusty rug in the middle of the floor. There were also fresh tire marks behind the barn. They led toward a disused logging trail that snaked deeper into the woods, but rain had begun to fall that evening, and most of the tracks were quickly washed away. As the hours turned into days, search efforts intensified. The state police brought in dogs, helicopters scanned the area with infrared cameras, and volunteers combed every ravine and stream bed for miles. But not a single trace was found. No van, no instruments, no bodies. Just silence. Alice Munro's mother, Julia, was the first to believe something worse had happened. While the town whispered theories of car accidents or even a possible runaway scheme to escape small-town expectations, Julia insisted Alice would never leave without saying goodbye. She said her daughter had made a promise to come home, that she had picked out her outfit for the festival weeks earlier, and had written a new song called Hollow Pines, which she planned to debut that very night. Julia's voice quivered with something more than grief. She seemed to know deep down that her daughter had not simply vanished, but had been taken. Then came the phone call that changed the direction of the entire investigation. A week after the disappearance, Julia received a voicemail from her older sister in Erie. It had arrived late, buried under static. Her sister had saved the message because she believed it might be important. Julia recognized the voice instantly. It was Alice, sounding frightened and rushed. She said something vague, almost cryptic. She said, "If something happens, tell Mom I saw him again." The police tried to trace the origin of the call but found nothing. No number. The audio degraded further on each playback, but the message was clear enough to shake the foundations of Julia's belief. She now thought this was not a mere accident or some youthful rebellion gone wrong. Someone had hurt her daughter. possibly someone from the past. Suspicion quickly turned to Drew Simmons. Drew was older than the others by a few years and had always carried himself with a certain intensity. There had been whispers in the band community that he and Alice had grown distant after a brief relationship. Chris Keller once confided in a friend that there had been shouting during their last rehearsal 2 nights before the festival. But no one wanted to believe that Drew, a young man who poured emotion into every breath of his saxophone, could be capable of something darker. He had grown up in Grenville just like the rest of them. He had played church services and school dances. Still, the voicemail could not be ignored. Rumors began to coil through Grenville like smoke. Some claimed they saw the band's van parked outside of town 2 days before they vanished, though none of the sightings could be verified. Others said the group had been spotted at a gas station 40 miles west, traveling with an unknown 5th person. These leads were followed, but every path led to a dead end. The public interest faded over time. The posters came down. The news crews left. People moved on. But Julia never did. In time, the official stance became that the band had simply disappeared, likely victims of a tragic accident in the deep woods. Maybe the van had veered off a cliff no one had found. Maybe they had tried to camp and succumbed to the elements. But those who knew the woods best disagreed. There were no cliffs in that part of the forest. No hidden drops or treacherous crossings. The terrain was dense, yes, but not impossible. Something else had happened. Something careful. Something deliberate. Years passed. A generation grew up never knowing the sound of Alice's voice or the echo of Drew's saxophone. But a mother's memory is long. Julia kept every article, every report, every photograph. She returned to the barn every June 14th and sat in the folding chair her daughter once used, and in that silence she waited. Something had gone wrong in Grenville that day, and the woods, silent and untouched, seemed to know. In the weeks that followed the disappearance of the Arrows, Grenville became a town of shadows. Streets that once echoed with summer chatter and familiar laughter now held a quiet, hollow kind of tension. People still went about their routines, but there was a collective unease that hung in the air like a storm that refused to break. The sheriff's department had declared the band officially missing, though their words carried little weight for those closest to the case. Julia Monroe refused to let the silence consume her daughter's memory. She began knocking on doors, visiting anyone who had even the slightest connection to the festival or the band. Her questions were always the same. Had they seen Alice? Had they noticed anything strange? Most shook their heads with pity in their eyes. A few offered hesitant recollections of small details that Julia scribbled into a worn notebook. A green lighter left at the barn. A van that might have had its lights on long after dark. Nothing solid. Nothing that helped. The sheriff organized a second search party 10 days after the vanishing. Volunteers from Grenville and nearby towns assembled in the parking lot behind the town hall. They came with hiking boots, binoculars, maps, and coffee and travel mugs. Some brought dogs. Others carried two-way radios or wore reflective jackets. Julia stood among them, clutching the only photo she had of Alice with the full band. It had been taken at a fundraiser the year before. Everyone was smiling. Alice wore a necklace with a small locket that she never took off. The group was divided into quadrants, and the woods west of the Miller barn became a grid of hope and desperation. The effort stretched for 3 full days. People scoured ravines, followed deer trails, and even combed the dry riverbed that wound through the trees like a forgotten scar. But the woods offered nothing in return. No van, no personal items, no sign of struggle. Only silence and the occasional call of birds overhead. 2 items found during the second search gave investigators pause. Near a hollowed-out oak tree roughly 2 miles from the barn, someone discovered a scorched fragment of sheet music. The ink had bled from the page, but enough notes remained to recognize the beginnings of a melody. Julia knew it at once. It was Hollow Pines, the song Alice had planned to debut. The sheriff logged it into evidence and sealed it in a plastic bag. The other discovery was more ominous. In a fire pit a quarter-mile further, they found blackened remains of what had once been equipment cases. The metal latches had melted in the heat, and no serial numbers were left to trace. These items had not been naturally damaged. Someone had wanted them gone. The sheriff grew quiet after that. He ordered the search halted and requested assistance from the state police. Julia could see in his eyes that he was beginning to believe what she already knew. Someone had done this to them. A separate investigation began to form in quiet corners, fueled not by law enforcement, but by personal vendettas and grief. Chris Keller's brother drove up from Maryland and tried to hire a private investigator, but he was turned away. Jonah Reed's parents stopped answering calls from the media and moved away by the fall. Only Julia remained visible, still posting flyers and asking questions. It was during one of her late-night organizing sessions that she noticed a bank withdrawal form left in an old envelope she had forgotten. The name at the top was Roger Kessler, the festival organizer. The withdrawal was dated April of 1986, 2 months before the event. Julia stared at the number. It was $25,000, a large amount for anyone in Grenville, too large to ignore. Julia brought it to the sheriff the next morning. He listened quietly and thanked her, but she saw the way his fingers tightened around the page. She asked if Roger had been questioned. He said yes, twice. But Julia pushed harder. She told him about the rumor she had heard, that Roger had taken out a life insurance policy on the band, that he had been the one who encouraged them to play the festival for exposure instead of money. The sheriff did not respond. His silence was a confirmation in itself. Julia left the station with a weight in her chest, a mixture of dread and certainty. Roger had been close to the band. He had even driven them to a show once in Pittsburgh. Why would he insure them unless he anticipated a loss? The story took another turn when Julia revisited the barn alone in mid-July. She brought a flashlight and a crowbar. Her intention was to find anything the official search might have missed. In the back corner of the barn, beneath a stack of forgotten plywood, she found a discarded cassette player. The battery compartment was corroded, but the tape inside was labeled in red marker, "Rehearsal Room." Julia brought it home and found an old stereo in her attic that still worked. She played the tape late that night. Static buzzed at first, followed by the soft hum of tuning instruments. Then came voices, laughter, chords, and finally an argument. A male voice was raised. Another tried to calm him. Then Alice's voice broke through, sharp and scared. She said she was done. She said someone had lied. There was a scuffle, a loud crash, and the sound of something being knocked over. The tape ended abruptly. Julia played it 3 more times before she stopped. She could not be certain who the other voices were, but she knew her daughter's voice. It had not been a rehearsal, it had been a warning. The state police eventually reopened the case in September, prompted by pressure from local reporters who had heard about the tape. Julia provided them with everything: the audio, the sheet music, the scorched cases. But as the leaves turned and winter crept in, the trail went cold again. The forest had swallowed them. And though suspicions swirled, no one was charged. No arrests were made. The town returned to its slow rhythm, older now, marked by the year the music stopped. Julia continued her vigil. She still believed the truth was buried somewhere just beyond reach. 7 years passed without progress. The investigation files grew dusty in the back room of the sheriff's office. Julia Monroe, now in her late 50s, lived a quiet life, but grief had become her constant companion. Her house bore the silence of absence, and Alice's room remained untouched, as though she might return any day. Most nights, Julia sat with the same mug of chamomile tea and stared at the folder she had assembled over the years. Newspaper clippings, maps the cassette recording, and photos of Alice smiled back at her with a stillness that pierced the heart. She believed the story was not yet done. One morning in late March, while cleaning out the attic for the first time since the year of the disappearance, Julia found a small tin box that had belonged to Alice. Inside were ticket stubs, love notes, and a folded piece of paper wrapped in a faded napkin. The handwriting was unfamiliar at first glance, jagged and inconsistent. It was not Alice's. It was Drew Simmons. The napkin note had a smudged corner, but remained mostly legible. At the top, Drew had written one line again and again, as if in a trance or as a desperate confession. The line read, "Buried in silence beneath his lies." Julia sat on the floor of the attic, her breath shallow as she read those words over and over. Her mind reeled. It felt cryptic, but there was something heavy about the repetition. Below the repeated phrase were half-formed lyrics, notes about rhythm and saxophone phrasing, and a reference to hollow pines. That song had haunted Julia for years. She had always believed it carried a message that Alice never had time to deliver. The handwriting seemed hurried, anxious. It matched nothing that Drew had submitted for their previous recordings. She compared it to his known notes and saw the contrast. Something had happened in those final hours, something serious enough to make Drew put this in writing. Determined to understand the deeper meaning, Julia visited a retired music teacher named Richard Coleman, who had mentored the Arrows in their early years. She explained the discovery and handed over the note. Richard spent time reviewing the musical elements and confirmed that the language used in the scribbled parts was not merely lyrical. It suggested coded instruction. The phrase, "buried in silence beneath his lies," could have been metaphorical, but in combination with the musical annotations it hinted at something spatial, a physical location. Julia's hands trembled as she took the note back. The phrase had the weight of a confession. It no longer felt poetic. It felt directional. She drove back to the Miller barn that evening, parking her car just as the light drained from the sky. She walked the perimeter flashlight in hand, pausing every few feet to mark the ground with a chalk. She searched until midnight. Nothing unusual stood out, but something inside told her not to stop. She went back 2 days later and again found herself in the barn's far corner. She peeled back layers of rotted wood paneling and uncovered a rusted metal cover embedded into the floorboards. It had no handle and was flush with the boards nearly invisible unless specifically looked for. Her breath caught. She called the sheriff's office, though she feared they would dismiss her again. To her surprise, Deputy Marine arrived within the hour. He was young, new to Grenville, and had never seen the case file. But he took one look at the metal cover and ordered it opened. What they found was not a body, but another box. This one was newer than the tin Julia had found in the attic, but still years old. Inside were reel-to-reel tapes and a notebook, both labeled with Drew's name. The notebook held practice logs, bits of music theory, and a final entry that read, "I do not know how much longer I can be around him. He blames her. He thinks she knew. I thought I knew him. I was wrong." The entry was dated 1 day before the festival. Julia and Deputy Marin exchanged a look of stunned understanding. This was not a random disappearance. This was unraveling into a confrontation that none of them had fully imagined. Drew had feared someone close, someone they had all trusted. As the town stirred once more with whispers of the old case, Julia was approached by Helen Greeley, who had once been close to the band through her work at the local community center. Helen handed over an envelope she had kept hidden for years. She said it was something Alice had given her days before the concert. Inside was a photograph of the 4 band members at the rehearsal barn. Everyone was smiling, but Julia's attention was drawn to the mirror in the background. In the reflection stood a man partially obscured just outside the barn. Julia recognized him instantly. It was Roger Kessler. No one had known Roger was near the band during their rehearsals. Official records placed him organizing logistics for the festival in town. This photo placed him at the scene without explanation. Julia took the photo to the sheriff, who reopened the case once more, this time with more resources and state support. Roger was questioned, but he denied being at the barn. He claimed the photo was manipulated. The state forensics team confirmed the image was real, taken with a film camera consistent with the date. The reflection belonged to Roger. He had lied. What had once been viewed as a disappearance now carried the elements of betrayal and manipulation. Drew had left behind notes filled with dread. Alice had warned her friend in advance. Their music, once their only refuge, had somehow become entangled in the threat that consumed them. Julia no longer felt like a grieving mother. She felt like the only one still holding the key to the door no one else wanted to open. By the fall of 2010, Julia Monroe had become more than a grieving mother. She had become a historian, an archivist, and a quiet investigator whose home now resembled a private museum dedicated to the vanished. Her dining room table was permanently covered in maps, handwritten logs, photos, and cassette tapes. One wall had been turned into a timeline pinned with string and color-coded tags. The years had carved lines into her face, but her eyes remained sharp with purpose. She no longer waited for the sheriff or the state to find answers. She had taken the burden into her own hands. Her days began with coffee and ended with printed satellite images she ordered from a local drone pilot. Her obsession was no longer just about Alice. It had become about all of them. Chris, Jonah, Drew, and yes, even Roger Kessler. Julia believed someone had planned something before that concert. She believed that someone had executed it with care and then buried it deep beneath layers of community indifference and time. When the new drone images arrived in November, she spent 3 evenings studying the terrain west of the barn. The high-resolution shots showed patterns in the soil that had not been visible to the naked eye. A faint trail, no longer in use, curved through the trees and terminated at a wide clearing that had once been home to an old tractor shed. Julia marked the location and visited the site alone. The air was sharp with the scent of frost and pine. The shed was gone, but the ground was uneven, disturbed. She knelt near a patch of blackened earth and scooped at the soil. Beneath a thin layer of leaves, she uncovered what looked like rusted wire mesh. Nearby, she found remnants of what might have been a fire pit. Ash mixed with soil and something else. She placed the debris into a sealed bag and brought it to the local college chemistry department, pretending it was for a class project. A week later, the results came back. The material showed traces of synthetic fiber consistent with instrument case linings. It also contained small fragments of brass and melted lacquer. Julia knew immediately what it meant. The band's instruments had not been lost. They had been destroyed and possibly burned at that location. She contacted Deputy Marine, who agreed to revisit the clearing. A proper excavation revealed 2 charred metal frames partially melted into the ground. Forensic testing confirmed what Julia already knew. These were once cases that held instruments. The sheriff reopened the case officially, though he offered no promises. Julia did not expect miracles. She only wanted truth. But the revelation sparked another fire in her mind. If someone had burned the instruments, what had they done with the van? The question haunted her in new ways. She began reaching out to retired officers, tow truck drivers, and old road workers who had been active in 1986. Most had retired or passed on, but one man named Gerald Huxley remembered something strange. He had been working county roads that summer and recalled being called out to repair a gate near the state border about 30 miles from Grenville. The call had come from someone claiming to be from the festival staff, but the number was never confirmed. Gerald had arrived to find the gate padlocked, and a heavy tire trail leading into a restricted part of the forestry land. He never saw a vehicle, only the signs of one. Julia convinced the current county engineer to provide her access to records of road repairs from that year. She found the incident logged under a vague entry marked "Unauthorized Lock Removal." The forestry land had since been repurposed, but the area in question was now part of a conservation zone. She visited the zone the next week with a retired surveyor who volunteered to help. They followed the old path through thick underbrush until they reached a series of ridges and outcroppings. The trail was faint but still present. The surveyor pointed out an unnatural depression near a boulder cluster. Julia marked it and called Deputy Marin again. The next day, a team with ground-penetrating radar scanned the site. They found anomalies 2 feet below the surface. Further digging revealed an engine block corroded but still intact. VN records confirmed it belonged to the van owned by the Arrows. The van had been buried, not rolled into a ravine, not stolen. Buried. It had taken 24 years for it to be found just under 30 miles from where the band had last been seen. Investigators carefully extracted what they could. The inside had been gutted. No seats, no upholstery, no personal items. Just scorched remnants of wiring and metal, as if someone had stripped it clean and set fire to the shell before entombing it. The discovery shook the town again. The local paper ran the headline, "Musicians Vanish No More," as authorities now treated the case as homicide. But Julia was not surprised. Her obsession had never been about proving something bad had happened. She had always known that. Her focus had shifted. She wanted to prove who had done it and why. The discovery of the van renewed public interest. Reporters returned. State detectives re-interviewed old witnesses. New people came forward. A woman named Carla Boyd, who had worked in the back office of the Grenville Town Hall, said she had seen Roger Kessler speaking with a man in uniform late at night just days before the concert. She could not recall the name on the badge, but remembered the man had a scar across his chin and wore a silver ring. Deputy Marin dug through old employment records. One name emerged. Officer Brent Vickers, a part-time officer who had left the force in 1987 and moved west. No one had spoken of him during the initial investigation. His personnel file was thin and contained no follow-up notes. Julia took one look at his photo and felt something collapse in her stomach. She had seen him once before in the background of another picture from the festival posted near the food trucks. He was not listed as part of the security detail. No one had mentioned his presence. And yet there he was. By early spring of 2024, the investigation had taken a sharp turn. With the van unearthed and the old name of Officer Brent Vickers resurfacing, Julia Monroe found herself in regular contact with state investigators who had reclassified the case as an active homicide inquiry. Julia's own role remained unofficial, but her knowledge of the case had become indispensable. One morning, she received a call from a land development office in Edgewood, a small township 40 miles south of Grenville. A crew had been clearing forested land for a new wellness retreat when they unearthed several hard cases buried tightly beneath layers of soil and tree root. The crew had initially thought they were military crates, but when one broke open they saw what looked like part of a brass saxophone wrapped in deteriorated cloth. The sheriff contacted Julia immediately. She arrived before forensics had even finished documenting the scene. The clearing smelled of pine and damp earth, and the instruments had been buried in what appeared to be a deliberate arrangement. Each case had been carefully positioned. Some were stacked. Others lay side by side. All bore heavy signs of water damage and exposure. The guitar case was unrecognizable until Julia noticed a familiar pink thread woven into the strap. Alice had sewn it herself. Her knees weakened as she touched the surface of the case. She no longer hoped to find Alice alive. But she had never stopped hoping to find the parts of her that had once made the world feel full. Forensic teams confirmed that the saxophone was Drew Simmons' con tenor an instrument he had refurbished by hand during college. The burn marks on the lacquer matched the chemical traces found at the first burn site near the old shed. The bass guitar was harder to identify, but the model matched one Chris Keller was known to use. Only the violin case was fully intact. It held no violin. Inside were newspaper clippings from 1986, folded tightly, each one describing the band's disappearance. Someone had kept them, sealed them, and buried them with the instruments. One clipping featured a photo of Alice, her eyes half lowered, smiling without revealing her teeth. Julia remembered that expression. It was the look her daughter wore when she was guarding something. A secret. A question unspoken. The instruments had not simply been hidden. They had been buried as if in a ritual, a kind of silent memorial. Or a message. Further excavation around the clearing revealed scattered buttons, guitar picks, and a crushed harmonica. But there were no bodies. No personal effects. No trace of clothing or blood. The cases had been emptied of meaning and then set into the ground. The sheriff's office believed the burial had occurred no more than 10 years ago. Julia struggled to process the timeline. If the instruments were only buried recently, where had they been all those years, and who had decided it was time to move them now? Theories began to swirl. Some believed someone had kept the instruments as trophies only to panic when the investigation reignited. Others believed they were moved in stages, first burned, then buried. Julia held firm to one thought. Whoever did this knew music. They had understood what these instruments meant. That knowledge had shaped the burial. The discovery gained attention beyond Grenville. Journalists from Pittsburgh and even regional outlets from Philadelphia reached out. Julia declined interviews. The case had become too fragile. Deputy Marin called to inform her that they had tracked down Brent Vickers, now living under a different name in Arizona. He worked odd construction jobs and had never reapplied for police credentials after leaving the Grenville force. He had a family, a house on a dusty road. Marin said they were preparing an extradition order, but it would take time. Meanwhile, Julia received a package with no return address. Inside was a cassette tape and a note written in careful block letters. It read, "You should have stopped." The tape was blank. Only static played. But Julia knew it was no prank. Someone wanted her quiet. Despite the warning, she continued digging through her records. She focused on Drew's notes and journal entries, trying to find a pattern. In one scribbled margin, she found the phrase, "rehearsal, final cut." She remembered seeing it once before on a mislabeled envelope at the sheriff's office during the early days of the case. She called Deputy Marin, who allowed her access to the file room. The envelope had not been opened in over 20 years. Inside was a short reel of audio tape. They played it on a dated machine inside the evidence room. The audio began with footsteps, then the sound of Alice's voice echoing slightly as if recorded in a barn or warehouse. She asked if the door had been locked. Another voicemail answered that they only had a few minutes. What followed was muffled, but the tension was unmistakable. There was a sudden scream, not loud, but sharp, and then the clatter of something metallic falling. The reel ended abruptly. No identities were confirmed, but the voice patterns matched Drew and Alice. Julia covered her mouth with her hands. She had heard enough. The instruments had not been disposed of. They had been curated, perhaps even transported over time by someone with emotional ties to the band. The cases had not been thrown into a river or crushed in a junkyard. They had been treated as remnants of something lost, too dangerous to keep, but too sacred to destroy entirely. Julia believed now more than ever that there was another player in the story, someone they had overlooked. Perhaps someone who was close but never photographed. Someone who moved behind the scenes. She began listing every staff member from the festival, every person near the barn in the weeks leading up to the performance. A week after the discovery of the instruments, Julia returned to her dining room table, which had long since stopped being used for meals. The clutter of documents and photos now included a new addition. It was the cassette she had received in the anonymous package. Though it had only played static, she could not ignore the possibility that something had been encoded on it. She called a technician named Ryan Bledsoe, a retired audio engineer who had once worked for the Pittsburgh Symphony. He was known for restoring corrupted analog recordings. Julia met him at his workshop, a converted garage filled with magnetic tapes, spools, and calibration equipment. Ryan cleaned the cassette carefully, then transferred the content onto a digital system where he could isolate frequencies. After hours of adjustment, Ryan found a faint signal hidden beneath the static. The audio was weak and heavily degraded, but recognizable words emerged. The recording began with heavy breathing, followed by a voice repeating a phrase. She knew. She was never supposed to know. Then came a few seconds of silence, followed by what sounded like the crash of a chair, and finally a distorted male voice whispering Alice's name. The tape ended there. Julia sat in stunned silence, unable to move. Ryan asked if she wanted a copy. She said yes. She returned home and played the cleaned version twice more. Each time, the details felt heavier. The voice whispering her daughter's name was unfamiliar. Not Drew, not Chris, not Jonah. It carried a rasp, a hoarse undercurrent. She scoured the sheriff's files and her own collection for any audio or interviews that might match. In the old festival archives, she found a recorded radio interview featuring Roger Kessler. The clip was short-recorded days before the concert. He spoke in a calm and clear voice, nothing like the one on the cassette. Julia moved on. She reviewed public speeches, council meetings, old answering machine messages from the town hall. Nothing fit. Then she remembered the old voicemail from Alice, the one sent to her sister in Erie. She retrieved the file and played it again. The fear in Alice's voice was raw, but what struck Julia now was the background. A faint, deep voice was present, but too buried to understand. Ryan helped her run the voicemail through his system. They layered the cleaned-up cassette beneath it. A match emerged. The voice whispering on the tape had also been present in the background of Alice's final call. Whoever this man was, he had been near her just before she disappeared. Julia contacted Deputy Marine with the findings. He confirmed that Brent Vickers had been questioned and had no explanation for his whereabouts on the day of the concert. But the audio did not match Vickers. The sheriff's office now considered the possibility of a second unknown party involved in the cover-up. Julia returned to the barn once more. The place had changed little in nearly 40 years. The air still smelled of dust and mold. She walked to the far corner where the old cassette deck had been found years earlier. She tapped the walls, ran her fingers along every panel. Nothing gave way. Then she remembered Drew's notation. Rehearsal. Final cut. It sounded less like a label and more like a title. She began sifting through old boxes and crates left behind by previous visitors. In one broken crate beneath a torn tarp, she found a camcorder. It was a model from the mid-'80s, partially intact but with a broken viewfinder. Inside was a mini tape. She took it home. Ryan was able to restore partial footage. The video showed Drew and Alice practicing under dim barn lights. Their faces were tired but focused. They stopped to argue about the song's tempo. Then Alice moved out of frame. A shadow appeared near the door. Drew turned startled and dropped his instrument. The footage ended there. No faces. No voices. Just a sudden shift in atmosphere. Julia watched it again and again. The shadow had moved with confidence, not hesitation. The person had known where to step, had not stumbled or paused. They were familiar with the barn. Deputy Marin reviewed the footage. He had it enhanced by state specialists, but resolution limitations kept the figure unidentifiable. Still, the presence confirmed what Julia had long suspected. Someone else had entered that barn. Someone who remained hidden. Julia returned to her notes. She reread every description of the days before the concert. A name emerged that had once seemed peripheral: Leonard Pratt. He had been a part-time maintenance worker contracted to help prepare the stage and lighting for the festival. No one had interviewed him in detail. At the time, he had left town shortly after the concert was canceled. Julia tracked him down through public records. He was now living in Virginia under a different surname. Deputy Marin reached out formally. Leonard agreed to speak reluctantly. During the interview, he admitted to working late nights on the festival grounds. When shown the photograph from the rehearsal barn, he denied being present. When asked if he knew Alice, he paused. He said she had been polite. Nothing more. Julia sat in on the interview. She watched his hands shake slightly. She asked him directly if he had ever been in the barn. Leonard looked at her, then looked away. He said only that he had made deliveries. He refused to say more. Investigators obtained a warrant to search his property. In a storage locker he had rented under a secondary alias, they found several reels of audio tape. Most were blank or filled with rehearsals from local bands. One, however, matched the cassette Julia had received. It was the original. On its label was written, Alice Raw 5. Julia felt her knees weaken again. The truth had never been far. It had only been scattered, buried in fragments. In the days following the discovery of the audio tapes, Julia spent long hours re-examining every name tied to the band. One afternoon, while reading a stack of handwritten notes Drew Simmons had left behind, she noticed a brief passage she had overlooked. Drew had scribbled a sentence in the margin of one page. It read, "I remember how he stared at the creek like it still held something." The words struck Julia as symbolic at first, maybe metaphorical. But then she remembered a newspaper clipping from the 1970s about a drowning near the Miller property. She found the article again. It was dated July 1979. The victim was a 14-year-old boy named Marcus Simmons, listed as Drew's younger brother. The drowning had been ruled accidental. According to the report, Marcus had slipped while playing along the edge of the creek during a late summer afternoon. His body was recovered 2 days later entangled in reeds downstream. Drew, 17 at the time, had been the one to alert their parents. Julia felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The same creek ran behind the rehearsal barn. She wondered if Drew had deliberately chosen the barn because of its proximity to the place where his brother died. She wondered if he had unresolved grief tied to that land. Julia reached out to Richard Coleman, the retired music teacher who had mentored the Arrows. When asked about Drew and his brother, Richard hesitated. He admitted he had once walked in on Drew staring out at the creek during a break in rehearsal. Drew had told him the water never really changed, it only forgot. Julia felt certain that Drew's history with the creek had to be connected to what unfolded later. She requested access to the police report from 1979. When she received the file, she saw something curious. A handwritten note in the margin from the original officer stated that music had been heard near the creek around the time of the drowning. No further mention was made of it in the file. This detail felt like a splinter in Julia's mind. She traced the officer's name on the report. It was Brent Vickers, the same officer who had become entangled in the band's case years later. She confronted Deputy Marin with the documents. He agreed that the coincidence was troubling. 2 incidents, both involving Drew Simmons, both tied to the same location and both investigated or touched by the same officer. The state detectives reopened the 1979 case as part of their broader inquiry. Julia sat at home that night holding a photo of Drew and Marcus, both grinning in the sunlight, unaware of what time would take from them. The next morning, Julia returned to the creek. She walked to the edge of the bank where the old logs and roots reached out like fingers. The ground was soft and uneven. She stepped carefully, scanning the water. After several minutes, she spotted something unusual lodged in the mud under a collapsed willow. It was a rusted harmonica wedged beneath a knot of roots. She retrieved it and took it home. Ryan Bledsoe helped her examine the item. The harmonica was old, its metal pitted, but on one side was a faint engraving. M.S. Marcus Simmons. Julia's breath caught. It had remained there for over 40 years. Back at home, she dug further into Drew's journal entries. In one, he wrote about a performance they had planned at the creek. He said Alice had wanted to sing where the water was loudest. That line struck Julia as important. She reviewed drone maps of the land. One bend in the creek formed a natural basin where sound echoed more sharply. She marked the spot and visited it with a surveyor. They found shallow disturbances in the soil near the edge. With permission, they conducted a dig. What they uncovered stunned the entire team. Roughly 3 feet underground beneath layers of sediment and moss, they found a partial wooden box. Inside were several personal items. A guitar pick engraved with Alice's initials, a photo of the band, a folded piece of paper with music notation written in Drew's hand, and beneath it all, a child's sandal worn and partially broken. Julia's heart sank. It was consistent with the size and era of footwear a boy Marcus's age would have worn. The items suggested someone had created a makeshift memorial, or a time capsule. Possibly Drew, possibly someone else. The discovery was submitted to forensics. DNA traces were found on the sandal. The results confirmed it had belonged to Marcus Simmons. Investigators now believed that Drew had buried the items years after his brother's death. A private tribute, but the presence of Alice's pick and other band-related material complicated the timeline. Julia began to believe that Drew had not only been mourning his brother, but had become entangled in a growing web of resentment and emotional confusion. The connection between Alice and Marcus remained unclear, but a pattern was forming. Drew's grief may have been exploited by someone who understood how to manipulate loss. State detectives interviewed a former counselor who had worked at Drew's high school. She remembered him as a gifted musician, quiet, intense, and prone to isolation. She also remembered that in his senior year, Drew had been suspended for a violent altercation with another student. The counselor could not recall the student's name, only that the incident happened shortly after Marcus's death. Julia wondered if that fight had anything to do with how Drew processed the loss. She feared it also hinted at a capacity for deeper anger than anyone had realized. The investigators revisited Leonard Pratt's tapes. One contained background noise from the barn. Amidst the faint ambient sound, they isolated a voice humming a lullaby. Julia recognized the melody. It was the same tune Alice had sung to herself when she was anxious. The presence of that melody suggested she had been inside the barn shortly before something happened. She had not been merely a bystander. She had been in the center of whatever storm had built inside Drew. By early summer, public pressure had reignited the case with full force. With the discovery of Drew's private memorial site and the mounting implications tying past trauma to the band's vanishing, state investigators decided to pursue Leonard Pratt more aggressively. A warrant was issued for a deeper forensic sweep of his home. Julia was not told in advance, but she was contacted immediately when the search revealed a small locked trunk beneath the floorboards in Leonard's garage. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, some in coherent paragraphs, others in near gibberish. At first glance, they appeared to be fragmented lyrics. Upon closer inspection, the writings revealed something far more disturbing. They were journal entries. Leonard had kept detailed logs of the days leading up to the festival. The entries mentioned the band The Barn, and most notably, Drew's growing paranoia. One entry in particular stood out. It described Drew pacing in circles, muttering about the creek and saying she knew but forgave me anyway. Another noted a late-night visit from Roger Kessler, who had delivered a bottle and instructions. The context was vague, but the tone was clear. Leonard had been involved, and he had been following someone's orders. Julia felt the words press down like a weight on her chest. Leonard had seen the unraveling and done nothing to stop it. Deputy Marin arranged a formal interrogation. Leonard was brought to the station under heavy supervision. Julia was permitted to observe through the glass. Leonard appeared thinner, older than his years, and deeply exhausted. When the detectives confronted him with the journal, he stared at the pages in silence for nearly 10 minutes. Finally, he spoke. His voice was quiet but firm. He said Drew had asked for help. He said Drew was haunted by his brother's death and had become convinced that Alice knew something about it. Leonard described a moment 2 nights before the concert when Drew cornered Alice outside the barn. He accused her of lying. She tried to calm him down. Leonard said Roger showed up not long after. He told Drew to take a walk. He told Leonard to keep Alice inside. The detectives pressed further. Leonard hesitated, then admitted that Roger had asked him to hold on to something. A reel-to-reel tape and a bag containing what he assumed were clothes. He said Roger told him it was just a backup, in case the band backed out. Leonard never opened the bag. He buried it in the woods behind his house a week later. The search team located the burial site that afternoon. Inside the bag were 4 personal items: a scarf Julia recognized as Alice's, a belt with a custom buckle that belonged to Chris, a torn flannel shirt Julia had seen Drew wear in multiple photographs, and a pair of size 11 sneakers matching Jonah's last known pair. Each item tested positive for traces of blood. The material was too degraded for full DNA extraction, but matches with the known profiles from the families confirmed their authenticity. The case now shifted definitively into homicide. Roger Kessler was located in Georgia, living under his real name. He was taken into custody and brought to Pennsylvania. News of the arrest broke across local media within hours. Julia watched from her living room, clutching the edge of her couch, unable to breathe properly as she saw his face appear on television. Roger denied everything at first. He claimed he barely remembered the band. He said the insurance policy was legitimate and only meant as a precautionary sponsorship protection. But when faced with Leonard's confession and the physical evidence, he began to falter. Julia was called to the station the following day. She sat across from Roger in a separate room. She had asked for a moment alone. No glass, no microphones, just the 2 of them. Roger agreed. He looked tired, but still carried that confident posture she remembered from the festival planning meetings. Julia asked him one question. Why? Roger did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost detached. He said it was not supposed to go that far. He said Drew was unraveling, and they had tried to contain it. He said Alice had threatened to leave the band to go public with something Drew had confessed. Roger said it would have ruined everything. The sponsorship, the coverage, the spotlight. He said he had spent too much money to watch it fall apart. Julia asked him what had happened inside the barn. Roger stared at the wall. He said, Drew. Drew snapped. He said Leonard panicked. He said he tried to clean up the mess. He used those words, clean up the mess. Julia stood up and walked out. She did not look back. She did not cry. She drove home and sat on her porch for 3 hours watching the wind shift through the trees. The confession, though incomplete, confirmed what Julia had suspected for decades. It had never been an accident. It had been a calculated response to a moment of panic. Drew, broken by guilt and obsession, had confronted Alice. Things had escalated. Roger had stepped in not to help, but to control the fallout. Leonard had assisted not out of malice but out of fear. And then the silence had been buried piece by piece under layers of forgotten names and carefully constructed lies. State prosecutors prepared charges. Roger was indicted for conspiracy and accessory to multiple counts of homicide. Leonard agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. The bodies of the band members were never found, but the cumulative evidence allowed the state to close the case. Julia was given a private file with final reports. She did not open it right away. Instead, she took a walk along the creek near the bend where Drew had once stared into the water. She brought with her 4 flowers, one for each member of the band. She placed them at the edge and watched the current carry them away. In the months following the arrests and public release of the investigation's findings, Grenville underwent a subtle transformation. The town no longer whispered the names of the arrows. People spoke them aloud now, at memorials and in small gatherings with a sense of reverence and deep sorrow. The case, which had once lived only in fading photographs and hushed speculation, was now a documented tragedy. Julia Monroe found herself the reluctant center of the attention. Reporters left messages. Families of the other band members reached out to her for help, understanding the complicated legal language in the final court documents. She did her best to guide them. The house that had once held only silence now echoed with conversation and the presence of those searching for closure. Julia declined most interviews, but she agreed to one community event. It was organized by the Grenville High Music Department in collaboration with local arts sponsors. The event was called Hollow Stage. It was held at the same field where the 1986 festival had been planned. The grass was neatly trimmed, and stage scaffolding had been built from reclaimed wood donated by families around the county. Students played tribute songs and read letters written by those who had known Chris, Jonah, Drew, and Alice. Julia stood quietly near the edge of the crowd. She felt the ache of the years inside her ribs. She remembered Alice's laugh, the way her fingers hovered over guitar strings before a song began. She remembered her daughter's habit of twisting the ring on her right hand when she was nervous. Near the end of the ceremony, a student named Maya stepped onto the stage. She held a copy of Hollow Pines, the song Alice had written but never performed. Julia had helped reconstruct the arrangement from Drew's notes and Alice's scribbled lyrics. Maya sang with a soft, tremulous voice. The wind shifted through the trees behind the field. No one spoke as the final chords faded. The silence felt different this time. It was not the silence of loss. It was the silence that follows understanding. Julia closed her eyes. After the event, a retired detective named Earl Simmons approached her. He had worked briefly on the case in 1986 before being reassigned. He apologized for not doing more. Then he handed Julia a small envelope. He said it had been found in a forgotten file cabinet in the old records room during an unrelated cleanup. Inside was a Polaroid photo. It showed the band standing inside the barn posing with their instruments. But this photo was slightly different from others Julia had seen. It included someone else. In the corner, barely visible, was a woman. Her hair was pulled back. She wore a staff badge on her shirt. Julia did not recognize her. Deputy Marin helped track down the name on the badge. It belonged to Angela Reeds, a freelance photographer hired to document the festival setup. She had left Grenville the day after the band vanished and never returned. Her name had not come up during previous investigations. Marin obtained her last known address in Buffalo, New York. Julia felt something stir again, a tremor in the calm she had tried to build. She made the trip herself, accompanied by a local journalist named Aaron, who had been covering the case since the new findings. Angela lived in a modest apartment above a bookstore. She answered the door cautiously. Julia introduced herself. Angela stared at her lips pressed tight. After a long pause, she invited them in. The apartment smelled of lavender and old paper. On the walls were framed photos of landscapes and unfamiliar faces. Julia asked about the photo. Angela looked away. She said she remembered taking it. She remembered the moment. Alice had asked her to take a group shot after rehearsal. Angela admitted she never gave the negatives to the festival committee. She said she had been scared. when asked why Angela walked into the other room and returned with a box. Inside were 6 undeveloped film rolls and a leather notebook. Angela said she had seen something at the barn the night before the concert. She had gone to deliver the last stack of printed photos and had heard voices arguing. She recognized Drew and Alice. She also heard another man, one she had never seen before. When the shouting stopped, she peeked through the window and saw Alice sitting alone, her head in her hands. She took one picture. Then she left and never went back. She said she had carried the guilt for years. She had been only 22. She did not know what to do. Julia took the film and notebook back to Grenville. The state lab expedited the development. The photos showed fragments. Alice sitting on the barn steps. Drew in the shadows near the door. Another frame captured a blurred motion, possibly of someone leaving. The notebook held a list of times and faces Angela had observed during the week of rehearsals. One name appeared several times. It was Rogers. Angela had noted his presence at the barn multiple times, though his schedule claimed otherwise. Julia brought this to the prosecutor. Though the trial was nearing completion, the new material helped solidify Rogers' presence in the critical window of time. Julia returned to the field once more before the end of summer. The wind felt warmer. Children played near the edge of the woods. A new plaque had been placed near the stage. It listed the names of the missing. Julia placed a fresh flower beneath Alice's name. She sat on the ground and looked toward the tree line. She no longer expected to find anything buried, but she knew that memory had its own way of uncovering truth, not all at once, but layer by layer. The evening air settled gently over the fields of northern Pennsylvania as Michael turned off the engine of his pickup truck. The low hum of the vehicle faded into silence, replaced by the distant rustle of leaves and the sound of an owl calling through the pines. In his hands rested the weathered case he had dug out from beneath the floorboards of the old farmhouse, the same case he had first seen in that photo buried deep in his grandfather's barn. He stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the old farmhouse ahead, its silhouette familiar yet ghost-like in the dying light. The porch sagged in the center and the shutters had fallen from their hinges years ago, but to Michael, it looked just as it did in his childhood memories. This was where his father had grown up and where the mystery had begun nearly 4 decades ago. The house belonged to no one now, but tonight it held the final pieces of a story that had haunted his family for too long. Michael stepped slowly through the overgrown grass and onto the porch. He had not been back here in years, not since his grandfather's funeral. But everything had changed since that day in March when they found the buried instruments on the edge of the old concert field. That discovery had sent shockwaves through the town of Mill Haven, reopening wounds and dragging long-buried secrets into the light. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the faded photograph of the Mill Haven Quartet taken only weeks before they disappeared in 1986. In the photo, his father stood tall in the center, smiling under the summer sun, his violin in hand. To Michael, it now looked like a smile heavy with secrets. Inside the farmhouse, the air was stale with dust and old wood. Michael moved carefully, his flashlight beam sweeping across the walls. He stopped by the fireplace where a large painting of the valley once hung. It was gone now, leaving behind a lighter rectangle of wall. In its place, a small framed newspaper article had been nailed to the studs. Michael stepped closer. It was the original announcement of the Grenville Summer Music Festival, dated July 1986. His heart beat faster. He remembered this from the police files, but what was it doing here? Just below it, a folded piece of paper had been wedged into the wall. Michael gently pulled it free. It was handwritten in faded ink, the script unmistakably that of his grandfather. Michael read carefully the words, shaking in his hands, as the full truth began to emerge. The note described how the festival had been hastily organized, not by the musicians themselves, but by an anonymous patron with a vested interest in silencing the group. They had been planning to expose something that had taken place at the church the summer before. Michael knew the story vaguely. There had been whispers about a local priest, a man who left town suddenly in 1985. Rumors circulated, but no one spoke of it directly. The note hinted that the musicians had found something damning, perhaps a journal or recording, and had intended to make it public. The patron, who had once been a major donor to the church and the festival, had lured them to the countryside under the pretense of a performance and then orchestrated their disappearance. Michael felt the weight of the truth settle on his chest like a stone. This was not just a cold case. This was a cover-up spanning decades rooted in betrayal and silence. He sank into the dusty armchair by the window, the letter trembling in his grip. The room was quiet, but his thoughts raced. He remembered how his father had once taken him to that same concert field, pointing to the distant woods and telling him to listen closely. You might still hear the music he had whispered. At the time, Michael thought it was just a story. Now he wondered if it had been a clue disguised as nostalgia. His father had never spoken of that day again. He died before Michael could ask him what he really meant. Michael rose and walked toward the back of the house. He passed the kitchen, its counters still scattered with old recipe cards and a jar of dusty preserves. At the far end of the hallway, he reached the cellar door. He hesitated. He had never dared open it before. His grandfather had always kept it locked and the key had disappeared after the funeral. But tonight he had found it in the same case as the instruments. With a steady hand, he turned the key and opened the door. The stairs creaked under his weight as he descended, flashlight casting long shadows along the stone walls. The air was damp and cold, smelling of mildew and earth. At the bottom of the steps, he found another door, this one reinforced with steel. Inside the small room was a table, a wooden chair, and shelves lined with cassette tapes labeled only with dates. Michael stepped forward, picked one up, and slid it into the old player sitting on the table. The tape crackled, then a voice emerged. It was his father. The recording described conversations they had secretly recorded with other musicians, including their fears about what the patron might do. Then came a long pause. A second voice, older, colder, echoed through the speaker. It was a warning. It ended with a simple sentence that made Michael's blood run cold. If this gets out, none of you will ever perform again. Michael stood in silence, surrounded by the proof he had searched for all these years. This was it. This was why they vanished. They had been silenced because they had tried to speak out. He knew what he had to do. He gathered the tapes, the letter, the photograph, and returned to his truck. That night, he did not sleep. Instead, he drove to the local newspaper office and left the materials in an envelope marked urgent. Then he sat outside waiting for the sun to rise. The story broke 3 days later. It spread quickly, first through Millhaven, then across the state. People came forward confirming the patron's influence in both the church and the community. Investigations were reopened. A formal memorial was held for the Millhaven quartet, attended by hundreds. Michael stood in the back, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, as names once buried in silence were finally spoken aloud with reverence and sorrow. In the weeks that followed, the farmhouse was cleaned out and eventually sold. Michael kept the instruments, restoring each one to playing condition. On the anniversary of their disappearance, he organized a concert in their honor. Young musicians from across the country came to perform. The stage was built on the very spot where the instruments had been found. As the final notes rang out across the fields, Michael closed his eyes and imagined his father's voice again, soft and steady in the evening breeze. He had once feared that silence would be all that remained, but now he understood that music like memory could not be buried forever. And in bringing the truth to light, he had not only honored those who had vanished, but given voice to a generation that might have otherwise remained unheard. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe for more mysterious and emotional journeys. Let us know in the comments what you think about the plot and where in the world you are watching from. Your thoughts help keep these stories alive.